Will you be able to hear me okay out there? Can you hear in back? Okay. It's a great pleasure for me to be back in Oregon, with which I have many pleasant associations, including summers spent repeatedly at Black Butte Ranch to the east of here, my first experience with whitewater rafting on the Rogue River, visits to Oregon State University and the University of Oregon, and then being the father of a teenage son who is fanatically devoted to amphibians and reptiles, snakes, salamanders, and frogs. And Max and I spent a happy time chasing amphibians here, polished off with a dinner of ostrich, the only time in my life that I've eaten ostrich. So, many happy reasons to be back here. This evening I wanted to tell you about new developments in connection with my book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, since it was published 7 years ago. New developments which I had a chance to review on the occasion of the book's reissue in a new edition a year ago. As background, though, let me tell you what the book itself was about, the original book. It was about the question why history unfolded differently on different continents over the last 13,000 years. For example, just to make the question personal, as I look out at you this evening, it appears to me that the vast majority of you here are of Old World origin, that's to say of Eurasian, European, Asian, African backgrounds, and only a minority of you here are of Native American ancestry. And yet if we could have been at this spot 500 years ago, everybody here would have been of Native American ancestry and no people of Old World background. Why did history turn out that way? Why didn't it turn out the reverse way? Why was it not the case that the Aztec Emperor Montezuma instead sailed off to Europe in a fleet of ships and conquered, infected, exterminated, drove out most original Europeans, with the result that the last original Europeans today are living in somewhere up in the Alps or Pyrenees? Didn't happen that way. But why not? That's part of the biggest, most interesting, most important question of history, but it proves to be an unexpectedly difficult question to trace back. The immediate explanation for the European conquest of the Americas rather than an American conquest of Europe is clear. The immediate reason had to do with differences in technology, military technology, state organization, nasty germs, writing, summed up in the title that my wife conceived for the book after I had finished the manuscript, Guns, Germs, and Steel. As of the year AD 1492, when Columbus sailed, guns, germs, and steel were widespread on the Eurasian continent, but not in the New World. And of course, the empires with the guns and the steel armor and weapons and the nasty germs and the riding and the horses conquered the tribes and chiefdoms and a couple of empires with stone and wooden tools and with only local riding and without the nasty germs. That's clear, but the real question is, why did guns, germs, and steel develop in Eurasia before they could have developed in the New World? Anthropologists tell us that advanced technology, such as guns and steel, and settled societies and empires and states are the product of the sedentary, densely populated societies producing food surpluses that are made possible by agriculture instead of the hunter-gatherer lifestyle that prevailed until 13,000 years ago. That's to say, with agriculture, people can settle down in villages, there's a population explosion, the farmers can produce food surpluses that can be used to feed people who devote all their time to figuring out how to smelt copper and then bronze and iron, and how to organize themselves and administer themselves in chiefdoms and kingdoms. That then is a result of the development of agriculture. Agriculture unfolded at different rates on the different continents over the last 10,000 years. So the real question then is, why the different origins of agriculture? Why did agriculture rise spontaneously only in 9 different parts of the world? Earliest in the Fertile Crescent and China of the Eurasian continent, and then in Mexico and the Andes, and a few places in Africa and the New Guinea Highlands, but only those local places. That was the most difficult question, the ultimate question behind Guns, Germs, and Steel. And there the answer turned out to be that the vast majority of wild plant and animal species don't lend themselves to domestication and have never been domesticated. Only a few wild plants and animals have been domesticated, can be domesticated. Animals such as cows, sheep, goat, pigs, and horses, plants such as wheat, barley, and peas. And it happened that the largest number of domesticable wild plant and animal species were concentrated in just a few areas, especially the Fertile Crescent, China, and those other areas that I mentioned. So the hunter-gatherers who had the good fortune to be living in the areas, in the parts of the world with the largest number of domesticable wild plant and animal species, got a head start on farming 10,500 years ago, and that meant a head start on village living, population explosion, food surpluses, the ability to feed inventors and people who figured out how to practice metallurgy, and so a head start on the development of guns, germs, and steel. That's then a short summary of 13,000 years of history on the 5 continents, to which I dedicated 420 pages in my book, and I've now given you a short summary of everything that happened to everybody in 3 minutes, but I think I've hit the high points of what happened and why it happened. That was the material of the original book. But since the book was published in 1997, I've talked about it, and I've gotten comments and suggestions and criticisms from audiences such as all you here, and I've gotten lots of emails and letters and phone calls from people. And out of that all have come some interesting extensions and new developments related to the book. And so when the occasion arose a year ago to issue a new edition, I summed up some of these advances since 1997. I'll tell you about 4 of them this evening. 2 extensions of the original material of Guns, Germs, and Steel, and then 2 new developments, 2 areas to which I had no idea that the book applied when I first published it. The first extension that I'd like to tell you about has to do with the question, how does technology spread around the world? So we've got guns developed in one place, and people figure out in some area how to produce steel, but how do guns and steel spread around the world? For example, the transistor was invented in the United States in the 1940s, but it wasn't exploited here. The transistor spread to Japan, where it was exploited commercially, and then spread back to the United States. Or gunpowder was invented in China, from which it spread throughout Eurasia. Or the alphabet was designed in the northern Sinai Desert, of all places, and the alphabet has spread around the world. How does technology spread? That's an interesting question that's been illuminated in the last half dozen years by 2 books published about a phenomenon in New Zealand history called the Musket Wars. The Musket Wars are very instructive of how technology spreads. Here's the idea on the Musket Wars. The native people of New Zealand are a Polynesian people called the Maoris. And the Maoris traditionally had stone and wooden tools. They did not have metal tools. Around 1800, European settlers from Britain came to New Zealand, and a few of them settled down to become traders to trade with the Maoris. And what they could offer the Maoris included European clothing, but also guns, muskets. The European traders settled down in an area in the northern end of New Zealand, and they bought things from the Maoris for which they paid with muskets. By around the year 1818, there were now lots of muskets just at this one place in northern New Zealand at the area, this one Maori tribe where the European traders had settled down. And what did that tribe want to do with its muskets? It wanted to turn them on its traditional enemies because the Maoris were a warlike people fighting with each other. And so the tribe that first acquired muskets took the opportunity to set the ledger straight, and it began killing the defenseless people in the next tribe who had only stone and wooden tools. And the people in the next tribe saw that they were going to be wiped out, so they scrambled to acquire muskets of their own from the European traders in order to equalize the balance with the first tribe, and then they used their muskets to turn against another neighboring tribe, which again saw that it was going to be wiped out unless it could acquire muskets. And then the tribes that first acquired muskets began to use them in long-distance raids, getting into their war canoes and traveling 500 or even 1,000 miles down the length of New Zealand and beginning to wipe out or enslave or conquer the lands of defenseless tribes without muskets. That was the phenomenon in New Zealand history called the Musket Wars from 1818 to 1832, in which the tribes with muskets turned them against the other tribes. And after 14 years of musket wars, by 1832, all the surviving Maori tribes had muskets, and those tribes that did not acquire muskets had been wiped out or conquered. That's how muskets spread throughout New Zealand, namely by competition between societies. Those societies that did not have this potent new technology either had to acquire it in order to even the competition or were overcome by the society that did have the advanced technology. Those musket wars then are a model for how technology spreads as a result of competition between societies. When today we think about the spread of military technology, something that we're worried about is the possibility of the spread of the most potent military technology today, nuclear weapons. Are nukes going to spread in the same way as muskets did in Maori New Zealand? Will nukes now be tested and used by North Korea and by Iran? And will that set off a series of scrambles, not musket wars, but nuke wars, in which those countries that have nukes use them against the countries that don't have nukes, and all countries scramble to acquire them. Those that don't acquire them get wiped out until after 14 years, everybody in the world who's left alive has nuclear weapons. Well, fortunately, it's not the case that technology, that potent military technologies, have to spread. There are many examples of military technologies and commercial technologies that did not spread. For example, the civilian supersonic transport, the SST. 20 or 30 years ago, the British developed a commercial SST, the Concorde, and the Russians then raced to develop one of their own, the Concordsky, and Boeing began to develop its own commercial SST. So it looked as if we were off to a musket wars, a race in commercial SSTs. But in fact, the commercial SST did not spread. The Russians abandoned their Concordsky, and within the last year, the British-French Concorde was abandoned too. This then was a potent technology that did not spread but was abandoned. A military technology that did not spread was battleships. There was a battleship race that led up to World War I, and at the end of World War I, it looked as if there was a new battleship race brewing between Japan, the United States, and Britain. But then these countries decided enough of it, it's too expensive, and they proceeded to sink their battleships and to limit the number of battleships. So there was not then a battleship arms race immediately after World War I. During World War I, two potent technologies that were applied were poison gas. The Germans introduced poison gas, and the British and French said that's terrible, and then they started to use poison gas themselves. But after World War I, the leading military powers banned poison gas, and it did not get used in World War II. Or dum-dum bullets, expanding bullets with a soft nose that make a big hole in a person. Dum-dum bullets were banned and not used in World War I. And still a final example is that guns were introduced into Japan in the 1500s. And in a short time, Japan had the most guns and the best guns in the world. But then the rulers of Japan decided that this was a mistake and they abolished guns in Japan. These are examples then that illustrate that potent technologies don't necessarily spread, and what remains to be seen is whether nukes are going to spread in the way that muskets did, or whether instead a model for nukes will be World War I battleships and poison gas and dum-dum bullets, namely a potent technology that the countries involved decide they're better off without. That then was one interesting extension of the material of guns, germs, and steel. The other interesting extension in the last 7 years that I want to tell you about has to do with a question that can be summarized as Europe versus China. Most of my book was about differences between continents, differences between the Eurasian continent and the North America, South America, Africa, Aboriginal Australia. But when I finished the book, my wife pointed out to me, Jared, you can't publish a book comparing the histories of different continents without saying something about why within Eurasia was it Europeans rather than the people of China or India or the Fertile Crescent who spread around the world. And so I discussed this briefly in the epilogue to the original Guns, Germs, and Steel. And that question is still controversial. And here I have to say my view is a minority view. Most historians hold another view. The question of why Europeans rather than Chinese were the ones to spread around the world, to colonize, is especially puzzling when you reflect that as of the year 1400, China led the world by far in technology with the bigger ships, the best ships. The Chinese had invented compasses, sternpost rudders, ship bulkheads, printing, movable type, gunpowder, kites, advanced technology. And then between 1405 and 1432, the Chinese sent out 7 big fleets, gigantic fleets called treasure fleets, with up to hundreds of ships, enormous ships, bigger than any ships that Europe had at the time, fleets of up to 20,000 sailors. And these 7 treasure fleets sailed out from China to Indonesia and the Philippines, and then rounded the Malay Peninsula, and they came to India and into the Persian Gulf, and to east coast of Africa, and sailed down the east coast of Africa. And it looked as if these Chinese fleets were on the verge of rounding the Cape of Good Hope and then coming up the west coast of Africa to Europe, exploiting China's technological advantage, China on the verge of conquering Europe. It didn't happen. Instead, in 1432, the emperor, old emperor of China, died. There was a new emperor. And any country that invests in a big navy, navies are expensive. There are always arguments whether it's worth it or not. And so in China, there was an argument between the pro-navy and the anti-navy faction. The new emperor happened to get allied with the anti-navy faction. And so the new emperor said, this is a waste of money and we're not going to build more fleets. But because China was unified, the Chinese admiral who was in charge of the fleets, the equivalent of China's Columbus, when that one emperor said no, that was the end of China's treasure fleets. And that emperor not only stopped sending out fleets, but he dismantled the existing fleets. For comparison, just reflect what happened when an Italian called Christopher Columbus had this crazy idea of sailing across the Atlantic Ocean around the world. As of 1491, everybody sensible knew that the Atlantic Ocean would end in a steep upside-down cliff, and if you sailed a ship westwards across the Atlantic, your ships would fall off the edge of the cliff. And so when Christopher Columbus asked some Italian prince for money to give him ships, the prince said, you are stupid, your ships will fall off the end of the world, get lost. And so Christopher Columbus went to France and tried to sell his idea to the princes of France. And the Prince of France said, get lost. So Columbus went to Portugal and tried to convince the King of Portugal of his idea. The King of Portugal said, that's stupid. And Columbus then went to a Duke of Spain who wouldn't support him. And Columbus went to another Duke of Spain who also would hear nothing of it. And Columbus went to the King and Queen of Spain who said, ridiculous. And finally, a few years later, Columbus came back to the King and Queen of Spain who said, all right, here are 3 small ships, see what you can do. And we all know that Columbus sailed across the Atlantic, discovered the New World, found gold, came back, and that set off a race in which other European countries, Spain, Portugal, Holland, England, France, eventually Denmark, Germany, Italy, colonized as a result of Columbus's discovery. That's to say, Europe, because it was fragmented among 2,000 different principalities, that gave Columbus another chance. When the Prince of Italy said no, Columbus could ask other princes and kings. But in China, because China was unified and Europe was fragmented, Columbus had a second chance, and the Chinese Columbus did not have a second chance. In fact, China was unified for the first time around 221 BC, and it's remained unified for most of the time since then, whereas Europe has never been unified. No military genius, not even Caesar, Augustus, Charlemagne, Napoleon, Hitler, nobody has been able to unify Europe, and Europe is still divided into 45 states today. So the real question is then, why did China get unified early, and why, whenever it fell apart, did it get back together quickly? Well, Europe has never been unified. There are two theories about this. The prevalent view of historians is that China's unity is something with no deeper geographic meaning. That China lost its technological edge just because of chance to Europe, because of chance reasons. That Britain happened to get into coal after deforesting, which launched an industrial revolution, and that Europe happened to have a tradition of free universities, and that Europe happened to get into capitalism and mercantilism, and that Europe happened to have the Judeo-Christian tradition instead of the Confucian tradition, and the Judeo-Christian tradition was supposedly wonderful for science and technology, though you might ask Galileo his opinion about that. But the idea is that the fact that Europe expanded and had advanced technology, it was just a matter of chance. It could have gone the other way. That's a prevalent view. But I still have to ask myself, is it really just a matter of chance? Why did capitalism and free universities develop in Europe before they could develop in China? Is there any underlying reason? And that underlying reason I see as the geographic reasons behind China's unity. Just picture a map of China and a map of Europe. Just picture the coastline of China. It's relatively smooth. There are none of these deep peninsulas that indent the coastline of Europe. Europe has these big peninsulas, the Italian peninsula, the Greek peninsula, the Iberian peninsula of Spain and Portugal, the Danish peninsula, the Scandinavian peninsula. Each of these European peninsulas was big enough to become an independent state, an independent experiment in society, another place that a Columbus or an inventor could go for support. Again, Europe had these two big islands, Britain and Ireland, that became independent states, a new experiment in societies. China has no island remotely the size of Ireland. China's two largest islands, Hainan and Taiwan, are both smaller than Ireland and never became of political significance until Taiwan within the last several decades. Europe's rivers flow radially, and they divide Europe into sectors. The Elbe and the Rhine and the Rhone and the Seine and the Loire and the Po and the Danube. So Europe's rivers divide up Europe into different watersheds. Whereas China's two major rivers, the Yellow and the Yangtze River, flow parallel. There's low-lying land between them. Those rivers were quickly joined by canals, and China's rivers unify China. And then mountains. Europe is divided up by high mountains, the Pyrenees and the Alps and the Carpathians and the border mountains of Scandinavia, that again divide Europe, fractionate Europe into separate states. China is not so fractionated by mountains. There are then, I think, geographic reasons why Europe has always been fragmented and why China was unified early and remained unified. If that interpretation is correct, then it's something that's important today. China's unity has modern legacies, and Europe's disunity has modern legacies. I'm suggesting that disunity can be advantageous. And we've seen that in the last 30 years. China's unity permitted a dozen idiots in charge of the world's biggest country to abolish the educational system for 1 billion people, for 1 billion Chinese people at the time of the Great Cultural Revolution 20 or 30 years ago. Whereas Europe being disunified, it's never been possible for any idiot in Europe, there are plenty of idiots in Europe, but it's never been possible for any idiot to abolish education over the whole European continent. There's an example of the penalty that China's unity is still bringing to China. And conversely, Europe, now that it's trying to become politically and economically unified in the European Union, Europeans are very worried, deservedly worried, that in their rush for unity, they may be throwing away what historically has been Europe's major advantage, namely its disunity, meaning 45 different experiments. Those then are 2 extensions of the ideas in Guns, Germs, and Steel. I'll now finally tell you about 2 new areas that I hadn't dreamed of when I published the book. One has to do with applications of the ideas of Guns, Germs, and Steel to the business world. It didn't occur to me when I published the book that my book had any extensions to the business world. And then the book got reviewed by Bill Gates, who in his review said, the principles that Jared Diamond sees operating in history, I, Bill Gates, see operating in the business world. I see similar processes of competition between companies and communication between companies in the business world, just as Diamond sees operating between societies in history. And I got a letter from the head of an economic think tank in Washington, the McKinsey Global Institute, who wrote me to say that he saw parallels between the ideas of Guns, Germs, Steel and the economic organization of countries that McKinsey Global specializes in studying, and so he gave his book to his 250 partners. That surprised me. The result was that I had a long conversation with Bill Gates, who's a very thoughtful, interesting person, and I acquired friends in Microsoft, and I began to learn something about the business world. And it turns out, I think, yes, there are parallels between group competition and communication in history and group competition and communication in the business world, within a company, between companies in an industrial belt, between industries, and between different countries. For example, compare the organization of Bill Gates' company, Microsoft, and IBM. 30, 40 years ago, IBM led in American technology. And IBM gradually lost its lead, and Microsoft came to the top of American technology. But Microsoft and the old IBM were organized in very different ways that contributed to IBM's decline and Microsoft's rise. Microsoft is a very distinctive organization. Its research inventive arm is divided into lots of groups of 5 or 10 people who are given a lot of freedom to pursue their own ideas, and they can communicate freely with other groups within Microsoft. They're competing with each other. Ultimately, they're competing for support from Bill Gates, but they're given freedom for 5 or 10 years to pursue their ideas. Competition within a company, but a free flow of ideas. That was a very stimulating way to promote the development of new ideas within Microsoft, whereas the old IBM consisted of groups that were secretive and did not communicate with each other, and that was not a good way to promote innovation. And so IBM fell behind until about 10 years ago, IBM acquired a new CEO who reorganized IBM in a way similar to Microsoft. Microsoft then is organized in a way similar to Europe, fragmenting and deriving energy from the fragmentation, whereas IBM was more like, the old IBM was more like China. Another example comes from industrial belts. I grew up in Boston, and when I was growing up and going to school there, American technology, the center place of American technology, was Route 128, the circumferential road around Boston. But Route 128 lost its edge, and now Silicon Valley leads in technology in the United States. But the relations of companies to each other on Route 128 are quite different from their relations in Silicon Valley in a way that ultimately penalized Route 128 and was stimulating in Silicon Valley. In Route 128, around Boston, there There were lots of different companies, but people did not move back and forth between companies, and they were secretive and they didn't carry ideas. So yes, there was invention within a company, but there was not stimulation between companies. Whereas Silicon Valley is a free-for-all. People are jumping back and forth between companies. Companies compete fiercely with each other, but they also compete for each other's employees, and the employees carry ideas back and forth between companies. Fierce competition, but also lots of flow of ideas, and that's been very stimulating to the development of technology in Route 128, so in Silicon Valley. So Silicon Valley would resemble in its organization Microsoft or Europe, while Route 128 is organized more like IBM or China. The remaining example in the business world that I want to give you has to do with the German beer industry. My wife and I love German beer. The Germans can brew very good beer, as far as we're concerned, the best beer in the world. And so whenever my wife and I travel to Germany, we take 3 suitcases with us. Marie has a suitcase for her clothes, Jared has a suitcase for his clothes, and we carry along a 3rd suitcase, an empty suitcase, to fill up with German beer and bring back to the United States, and we then drink it for the next 2 years. Now, you might naively think that since the Germans can brew such great beer, they would be efficient at it, particularly because the Germans are quite efficient in other areas of technology, for example, in their metal industry. But it turns out that the Germans are horridly inefficient at brewing their great beer. The productivity of the German beer industry, the efficiency, is only 1/3 the efficiency of the American beer industry. What is the matter with German efficiency when it comes to the beer industry? Well, it turns out that the beer industry in Germany is organized like Route 128 and the old IBM. Namely, any of you who have been to Germany knows that Germany has no national brands of beer corresponding to Budweiser and Miller and Coors in the United States. Instead, there are local brands, and most beer in Germany, the local brands are different. Most beer in Germany is consumed within 30 miles of where it's brewed, so that each little brewery has a virtual monopoly of the local population, which likes the taste of the beer from that particular brewery. That means no competition in the German beer industry. 2,000 local monopolies. And those 2,000 little breweries in Germany, they're small. They're on the average 1/6 the size of American breweries. A small brewery has a small refrigerator vat and a small bottling line, but there are economies of scale in the beer industry. So American breweries, on the average 6 times bigger than German breweries, have much more efficient refrigerator vats and bottling lines. That's why American breweries are more efficient. Now, you may object and say, but the Germans can export their Lowenbrau beer to the United States, and it sells at prices that can compete with American beers. The next time you go to the supermarket to buy your bottle of Lowenbrau beer, read the label, and it will say, brewed in Canada and the United States under license. That's to say, the formula, the quality is that great German beer, but it's brewed in North America with the big vats and the long production lines. That's to say, with American efficiency, not with the low efficiency of the small German breweries. So that's an example then in the beer industry and in industrial belts and in individual companies of how issues of competition and communication between societies map out in the business world at different levels. The last extension of the ideas of guns Germany, the last new development that I want to discuss, an area that I hadn't anticipated, has to do with a central question of international economics, the question of what's called the wealth of nations. Why is it that some countries are rich and some countries are poor? For example, why are Iceland and Canada, why do Iceland and Canada have something like 120 times the per capita income of Zambia, Paraguay, and Chad? The usual answer that economists give to this central question of international economics is that it has to do with so-called good institutions, that there are certain institutions that promote the accumulation and investment of capital, and other institutions don't. Countries with good institutions become rich, and examples of good institutions that promote invention and investment include free trade, minimal government regulation, honesty, transparency in government, protection of private property rights, enforcement of contract, etc. Countries that have these good institutions become rich. Corrupt countries with trade barriers and over-regulation by government and lack of respect for private property rights don't become rich. And surely, good institutions are a large part of the explanation. The clearest example is for pairs of countries, each pair in essentially the same environment, where one country has good institutions, the other country has bad institutions, and the country with the good institutions is rich and the other one is poor. Those clear examples of the importance of institutions are the former West Germany, rich, and East Germany, poor. Still today, South Korea, rich, with very different institutions from North Korea, poor. Israel and its Arab neighbors, and then on the island of Hispaniola, the Dominican Republic, about 5 times richer than Haiti. So there's no doubt that good institutions play a part of the answer to this question, the wealth of nations. But that still leaves the questions, where did good institutions come from? Why do Iceland and Finland have good institutions while Chad and Paraguay don't? Good institutions surely are not just dropped in like a random variable. For the past 50 years, people in foreign aid have been trying to make poor countries rich by teaching them good institutions, and the results have been disappointing. So increasingly, economists are asking themselves, what are the prerequisites for good institutions? Where do good institutions come from? And what else is important in making countries rich besides good institutions? There have been interesting developments within the last 4 or 5 years, of which I had been unaware until about 3 years ago. Some economist friends told me, Jared, are you aware that your ideas are having a big impact, real impact in international economics? And I had no idea about this, but then I started talking to economists, and I've learned about how economists look at this question of wealth of nations. One way they look at it is they note a role of guns, germs, steel, a role of history in the development of good institutions. It's not an accident that Iceland has good institutions and Chad does not. Complex institutions are the product of a long history of agricultural societies and of the development of states and empires. It takes a long time to overcome clan loyalties, to transcend them into national loyalties. It takes a long time for populations to become accustomed to bureaucrats and centralized administration and a market economy, and to develop a cadre of experienced bureaucrats, and to develop education and writing and literacy. All that took 10,000 years to develop in Eurasia and in other parts of the world. So it's no surprise that if you try to drop all those things into a country like Zambia that did not have them until recently, Zambia cannot in 30 years duplicate the developments that took 10,000 years elsewhere in the world. In short, deep history related to agriculture, provides the explanation why the earliest agricultural societies got a head start on developing complex institutions. But complex institutions are not the only reason why some countries are rich and other countries are poor. Economists have been recognizing that there are other factors as well. For example, there are direct effects of geography. The tropics tend to have heavier burdens of diseases and public health problems. The tropics are burdened by malaria and yellow fever and parasites. I do field work in Indonesia, and the average Indonesian carries 6 parasites. Whereas in public health, there's a saying that the best public health measure is the winter of the temperate zones that kills parasites and infectious worms and germs. So tropical countries face a heavier public health burden. Tropical countries have lower agricultural productivity than temperate zone countries. And also landlocked countries are at an economic disadvantage compared to countries with a seacoast or with big navigable rivers, because it's much cheaper to transport heavy, bulky supplies by water than over land. Landlocked countries are forced to indulge in much more expensive overland transport. And that's part of why Chad and Paraguay and Bolivia are poor countries. The proof of the pudding that these other geographical factors are important, the proof of the pudding is that within the last 40 years, some countries have used that knowledge to become rich. The countries that have grown most spectacularly economically in the last 30 or 40 years are the so-called tigers of Southeast Asia. They're tropical countries, Singapore, Malaysia, Taiwan, Hong Kong, incipiently Thailand, and Mauritius in the Indian Ocean. These are tropical countries that realized that tropical countries are disadvantaged by public health problems and by agricultural problems, and so they decided that to become rich, they had to address their problems directly. They invested massively in public health, and they didn't try to become rich by developing agriculture, where they recognized they would be at a disadvantage compared to the temperate zone, but instead, Malaysia and Thailand and Singapore invest in things such as electronics and high technology rather than agriculture. And they've grown economically as a result. And finally, one can ask that if long experience of complex institutions is part of the explanation for wealth, why is it not the case that the parts of the world with the longest experience of complex institutions, namely the Fertile Crescent of southwestern Asia, where agriculture began, the area that today consists of Iraq, Iran, Jordan. Today, Iraq, Jordan, and Syria are certainly not the richest countries in the world. In fact, they're economic basket cases, except for the wealth arising from oil. Why then did they not remain rich when they once were the world's most advanced, richest countries? And there the answer is that the Fertile Crescent, the so-called Fertile Crescent, the people of that area have the misfortune to be living in a relatively fragile environment of low rainfall. The Fertile Crescent gradually committed ecological suicide as a result of deforestation and salinization and overgrazing in this fragile environment. So geography matters to the wealth of nations. In short, then, just to summarize, one can ask, beyond this question of the wealth of nations, does geography mattered in the past? It was the basis of guns, germs, and steel. But does geography still matter today? One might think in this day of the internet and of jet planes, when emails can travel from Portland to Tokyo just as fast as they can travel from Portland to Corvallis, does geography make any difference today? And the answer is yes, geography still does matter today more than ever. That's all the material that I wanted to present to you. And let's use some time now for questions and discussion and your own views. It's an opportunity for me to learn. I see there's a microphone over there, and possibly there may be a microphone over here. So if those of you who would like to ask a question, come up to, and there may be a microphone in the back, just come up to the microphones and we'll rotate among the microphones. Let's start over here. Let's start with this microphone. One question per person. That's
Hello?
dead. Animal species. The areas that got a head start included an area with a Mediterranean ecosystem in southwestern Asia, and Andean ecosystem in the Andes, tropical rainforest in the Amazon, montane rainforest in New Guinea. So the only thing that counts in launching complex societies is then domesticable wild plant and animal species. And on the second part of your question, people hammer away at their environment, and some societies collapse as a result of destroying their ecosystems. Question over here.
Dr. Diamond, do you see an ecological link between religious fanaticism and the various ecologies that cultures develop in?
That's a really interesting question. Any ecological link between religious fanaticism and where a culture develops? When I wrote Guns, Germs, and Steel, I could not detect such a link. And yet, one has to wonder. The proselytizing monotheistic religions, when one thinks today of religious fanaticism, one thinks of Islam, but it's not fair to focus on Islam. Christianity had more than a share of religious fanaticism and was in fact responsible for motivating the killing of more people over the last 500 years than any other religion. Is it an accident that these two monotheistic religions both developed in the same part of the Mediterranean zone of the Eastern Mediterranean, whereas the major religions of Southeast Asia, Buddhism and Hinduism, one might think were not so distinguished by religious fanaticism, though one might wonder about some branches of Hinduism. So this is a long-winded way of saying it's a very interesting question to which I'm not sure what the answer is. But a challenging question. Is there a question up in the balcony? Yes.
Yes, thank you. I have a question about your book. In the book you described that in order to domesticate an animal species, it was important that it already be in a herd-type mentality. And I was wondering if you had any ideas why the animals, like cows and sheep, that already evolved this herd-type mentality were all located in Eurasia.
Yeah, another very interesting question. They weren't all located in Eurasia, but you're right that most of them were. Out of the 14 big domesticated wild mammal species, 13 were located in Eurasia, and the 14th was the llama and alpaca of the New World. But it is the case that a disproportionate fraction of Eurasian species, and particularly Mediterranean Fertile Crescent species, were domesticable. And this suggests, also related to the first question, that maybe there's something about a Mediterranean ecosystem that selects for the herd behavior that lends itself to domestication. That's as far as I can get with it. But it's a question that, at the end of Guns, Germs, and Steel, I said this is a question for zoologists, and I'm still hoping that some zoologists will follow up on this. Why a disproportionate fraction of Eurasian species prove domesticable? Good question. Over here.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. I was wondering if you could comment on any commonalities you see among societies that successfully navigate potentially catastrophic ecological collapses, and how we might foster those characteristics in our own time.
Yes. What are the common characteristics of societies that successfully solve their ecological problems, and what can we learn about that today? That is the subject of my forthcoming book, which I was working on in my hotel room before coming over here, and which will be published either next January 3rd or January 10th, and which maybe I'll come back and talk to you about. Briefly, yes, there are characteristics of societies that succeed in solving their ecological problems. Part of it is that some societies face more difficult ecological challenges than others. There are fragile environments and there are more robust environments. But also there are differences among societies. There are societies that are organized in a way, for example, conflicts of interest between the elite and the masses that rewards the elite for doing things that are good for them in the short run and bad for everybody, including the children of the elite in the long run. So it's a mixture of both ecological factors and social factors. But that's a preview of my next book, so come back next year and buy my next book. Over here.
Well, I've also been looking into development issues, and I was wondering if you could comment on something I found very interesting and also potentially related to your work, and that is, if you, there are development experts who have looked at the ability of democratization to take root in countries, and they find a correlation with per capita GDP as long as that GDP is distributed among the population. It essentially is a form of power that gets distributed throughout the population. You see this kind of thing perhaps at work in China today. I'm wondering if there's an analogy to any kind of equivalent kind of threshold phenomena in terms of maybe agriculture taking root in societies, or any other analogies you can think of?
Interesting question. And again, this happens to be the subject of a manuscript that my secretary has been typing this week. I'm beginning to wonder whether I subconsciously planted these last two questions. It is the case. You are correct that wealth, particular sorts of wealth, are correlated with democratic government. And the example that's most often raised is another one, namely wealth that does not arise from natural resources. This is now another point, but it's paradoxical that countries that are rich as a result of oil or diamonds tend not to be democratic, but instead tend to fall apart in civil wars and tend to be autocratic. Then there's a literature among economists to try to understand what's called this curse of natural resources. This is a little tangential. It's related to your question, but you're correct that different forms of wealth have different consequences for the organization of government. Question up top?
Yes, I would like to go on to the fact that you were talking about Microsoft and also the IBM. In regards to that, right now Microsoft has a closed source and IBM pushing the Linux and open source or free flow of information. Just touch base on that in regards to the development of a business model of that, and also as corporations, as IBM even being before in the 80s, as you were speaking of, as the closed corporation or whatnot, still having the highest intellectual property rights of any other corporation, but now pushing towards more openness of the free flow of information and whatnot.
Yeah, the free flow of information in the business world, it's a delicate matter and it's a two-edged sword. On the one hand, you would like to get information freely flowing into you, and on the other hand, you don't want information freely flowing out to your competitors. And critics of Microsoft say that Microsoft exploits every legal means, and the critics say some means that may not be legal, to prevent information from flowing freely to other companies. What one can say for society as a whole, what may be good for Microsoft is not necessarily good for society as a whole. I think the lesson of Silicon Valley is that flow of information and vigorous competition and people jumping back and forth between companies is stimulating for the economy as a whole, although it may mean that individual companies rise and plummet. Perhaps let's take one final question from each, or is that it? All right, yeah. Okay. I will now read some questions from people who may have been shy. Written questions. How do you suggest we improve the wealth and consumption of developing nations, if at all? Very important question, yes. How do we make poor countries rich? And the conclusions that I draw from what I was talking about, the wealth of nations, are that yes, try to teach them good institutions, but that is not enough. In addition, if they're in the tropics, invest in public health. Investment in public health is a very cheap way of helping countries. For example, it's estimated that you could solve the world's 3 biggest disease problems: malaria, AIDS, and drug-resistant tuberculosis. You could at least make a good start on them by investing just $25 billion in public health. You can make a good start on solving them around the world. Whereas, for comparison, the war on Iraq, not the rebuilding, but the war on Iraq, was $80 billion, and the rebuilding is, what, $1 billion a day. And yet, countries that fall apart or that have difficulties for public health problems are likely to become breeding grounds for terrorists. So one suggestion would be to invest in public health, and another would be to figure out what your geographic location makes it worthwhile developing, and another involves figuring out what are the obstacles to good institutions taking. What are the obstacles that have to be overcome in order to promote the adoption of good institutions in Chad and Paraguay? And the other written question, what do you tell your sons about how to live a life of meaning? Interesting question. I tell my sons what a friend told me that his uncle had told him. Namely, my friend's uncle advised him when my friend was trying to figure out what to do with his life. The uncle said, pick something that you enjoy and that you are talented at and that does good for the world, and that's what you should do to select your career. Maybe that's a good note on which to end. Thank you.